Thank you all for being here. We've had a lovely weather with a heavy rain last night. Um, as we're talking about space-time continuum of museum at the backdrop of Kiranada Museum coming up very soon in the country, just to set context for what we're going to talk about today, when we know that Indian architecture has a long journey and long history and geographical variations. There's loads which is happening in the space of public and private institutions which are coming up in the country. Recently, Government of India organized something called International Museum Expo, where we got to know there are 76 museums coming up in the country at various parts of the country. Museums are a very critical narrator of our cultural markers. And keeping that in mind, I mean, it is what we say, it's a palimpsest of overlapping layers and styles and histories and identities. And cultural practitioners, architects like Martand and Rohit, have long referred to Asian architecture to better understand the society they were built in. Today in India, there are numerous cultural museums coming up and they're being established across the nation, and that's a critical point in terms of how our past represents today and tomorrow. These upcoming museums are defining the new cultural landscape for one of the biggest and most diverse country which we are in. They're presenting a moment that can reinterpret the role of museums as cultural markers that derive narratives across architecture, art, design, and our cultural identity. While their collection helps us catalog and collate how we value objects or artifacts or any story, the structures that houses them speak about the large narrative of our time. So what does that architecture say about us by referring the past to design our present? What are we saying to our contemporary? And I'm going to just drop a small line, and we're going to make Martin and Rohit talk about it. Architecture has always been seen as a marker of urban development. It's a living record of cultural and societal environment. If contemporary architecture continues to refer to the past, what are we saying about our present? Just quickly, if you want to delve into this notion.
Thanks, Amit, Martand, everyone. Thank you for coming. In terms of museums and the idea of museums as a cultural artifact and then the museum as a marker of a past, in the sense my experience with museums has been working with Kiranada as a co-curator with Rubina for the retrospective of my father's work, which we did in 2019. It was one of the first retrospectives done for an engineer, specifically for an engineer, where architecture took the background, but it was about the engineering that was. So based on that experience, if I have to keep architecture aside, it's a marker. Museums have that capacity to sort of bring forth histories, hidden histories that have happened, or histories which have overlooked and celebrated, and they bring histories to the present in one way. So that is at the level of when you're inside the museum, the capacity and the potential of the museum, which was always why the museum was created in a way. Even though it came from the West, the whole conception of the museum was the idea. I mean, I was just going through today because of what we were discussing, and the whole idea of museums, that MoMA did a show in 1964 where they spoke about the museum as being something that the Enlightenment got as a space, alternative space to church, as an alternate space of knowledge. And that is what now the representation of the museum that you are talking about, what we see here, and what does it talk about our present, and what we are talking about the present is suddenly that India, what I can see through the government initiative, through the humongous private capital that's being put into the idea of museum, without getting into the architectonics of the making, is that our present is really now sort of becoming much more, in a way, culturally aware, whether it's selective culture, whether it's curated culture, or whether it is, in some cases, like I would believe in the case where we are sitting today, it is really a passion for the arts. That our society is going through a transformation where we are sort of looking at the history and sort of looking at the structure that will be able to bring this history together. And it was interesting to read, there was an article about the National Gallery, the National Museum, which is going to get demolished in the Central Vista space. And it's again, that was during Nehru's time, that was the only sort of building which got the capital it required to be built the way it wanted to be built. It was done, it was CPWD structure built by the Oladekar, but they had the best stone, the best wood. It was Nehru who was personally involved. Nehru selected the curatorial team that came in and blah, 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 and the rest is history. What happened to it, we all know. But this whole agenda, and now it's getting displaced. We don't know where the artifacts will go, who is recording the artifacts, what is it, where is the new National Museum, we don't know. So when you talk about what is the past that is being communicated through the present, it's a very conflicted past and varied histories which are now coming up, and it's very difficult to say. I think there are multiple narratives there.
So, Martand, I mean, have you, as a practitioner, have you seen the transformation of purpose of museums to start with? I mean, we all started, there used to be a time when the museums were called a Zuba Ghar. I mean, when the Punjab or Calcutta museums happened, they started being as cabinets of curiosity. From there, keeping the Indian context in mind, all that past and today where we are, do you see the sense of the transformation of purpose informing the narratives of museum today?
So I think that the cabinet of curiosities and all is something that starts off in the 17th century, 18th century, and the trajectory of the history of museums has been slow. But what we're seeing right now, probably in our lifetime, from the 1980s onwards, that at an increasingly faster and faster pace, they are starting to become very significant cultural identifiers for our cities, and the role that they start to play, and the relationship that museums start to have. So with the city, and thereby with communities, etc. The great point of this, of course, was Bilbao, where it really starts to accelerate. And now we're seeing the impact of it here in the form of the new Kiranadar Museum, the Munjal Museum that's coming up. So there's a whole number of private museums that are coming up, but at the scale of them as well. But I think that it is, I think it would be problematic to sort of ascribe singular narratives to the movement of museums and their relationship with the city. So I think that we're in the middle of this very exciting time where museums are going through varied trajectories of relationships with society. At one level, they remain kind of monumental, monolithic, sort of, holders of collections of contemporary or historic objects. At other levels, their entire relationship, just in the last 50 years, is fundamentally changing with the city. So from being inward-looking buildings with no windows looking outwards, they are starting to create one whole sort of, vertical of museums that is coming out is really talking about the relationship of the museum to the outside city and interpreting its objects in relation to what the city is. I mean, I think the Whitney Museum becomes probably an interesting example because the Marcel Breuer building in New York was very inward-looking except for that one iconic window out. Whereas the Renzo Piano Whitney Museum is all about, like, at every level, you are looking out to the city and what does it mean, what is the relationship of the museum to the city, and vice versa. So there's one trajectory that's doing that. There are others that sort of, like the Guggenheim Lab, which are talking about, look, we are looking at the museum as a city. Just as the city becomes a museum, the museum also becomes a city. So we break it down. The museums start to become not just buildings that hold artifacts, art, but they become zones of debate, of knowledge creation, of discourse, of revolt. But not just within, excuse me, not just within the confines of the building. Guggenheim Lab in Berlin basically starts putting out outposts into the city. So small little units that start going outwards and start being instigators of discourse. So that's another way of looking at museums. You have the Anita Singh's museum, which is that of an individual, to a 1.2 million square foot museum, which is that of a larger organization. So even in scale, there is this variety of explorations from the micro to the macro. So I think that, and now this, of course, as you mentioned, the government is pushing a number of museums, and it's important to realize that we're not only looking at contemporary art and art or historic museums. There are museums of defense, there is museums of war, there are museums of navy and police and partition, and so there are a huge number of these are zones of knowledge and politics, right? Which are coming up in architecture. And I think that what makes sense to me is to speak about it from an architectural point of view, because as we discussed earlier, I think I prefer to limit myself here, because I think that otherwise it becomes too broad. But then the architecture, of course, then goes on to play this very, very important role about like what does that building represent? What does it mean at every level? And we could discuss the conceptual ideas. I'm not too familiar with the new David R.J. building, but conceptual ideas that he's exploring. And Rohit mentioned Charles Correa, and so that would be interesting conversations to go on. But I'm saying that there's a lot that is happening in terms of museums, and it's all very exciting. But,
yeah, I mean, you rightly said there are some museums which are archiving of a personal collection. Anita or Amarnath Sehgal's museum, which has recently come up. Globally, we have Peggy Guggenheim and we have Guggenheim. We have Pinot Collection doing as a museum. At the same time, we have Prada Foundation, which has a different storytelling and narratives to it. But talking from the architecture perspective, and both of you are working on some museums, which we're not going to talk about now, and you have been part of some museums. How does the philosophy of experience, when you're designing a museum, is getting informed by today's context?
Philosophy of experience. Why do I get the abstract questions?
I paid him before the talk.
So the whole. I mean, I'll elaborate that in terms of my experience. I mean, we are the structural engineers for this building. I think the technical head who's leading the whole engineering is sitting there, Man. You can say hi. And but I am an architect also, and we weren't involved with the conceptualization. Sudipto has to be here for that and discuss that. And David, ideally David. But I was heavily involved with Jatin Das's Center for Arts, which was a museum which is coming up in Bhubaneswar. And Doshi and B.V. Doshi and Jatin Das for 15 years designed it together, literally as friends. So it's a lovely narrative of a very small site. It's a 1 acre site. Long rectangular, which was near the caves in Bhubaneswar. And the whole idea for Doshi and Jatin Das was how to bring the city in. That was the only focus, how to bring the city in, how to make it something which is not a museum. Literally, it was the whole idea. And that's what we were discussing earlier with Korea, Doshi. It was all about the idea of the non-building. How do you let the building disappear and let the human experience take over? So it's not phenomenology almost in the sense of the the idea of the experience of, say, the sublime or the horizon. Or it's not about creating experiences which sort of bring out a certain, I don't know, a sort of a spiritual phenomena, through a spiritual phenomena, whether it's, moving towards horizon and capturing that, and then talking about the experience through that. But it's really about allowing the human to, I think Doshi and Korea always wanted to inverse this whole Western conception of phenomenology of architecture. It was literally the inversion of that, where the building disappeared, yet you experience. It was always about going into a cave, so to say. It was about light, it was about darkness, and it was about scale. And Korea did that in Bhopal Bhavan, where you come down a flight of steps into these courtyards which are diagonally connected, and you just have these light wells which lit the galleries inside. And the rest was opening into the lake, so there was this whole terrace. But it wasn't about moving into the horizon, it was really moving inside yourself through that. And Doshi has always done that through Sangat, through his School of Architecture. But in JDCA, the way that experience was really about bringing that cave into the site with these broken up buildings, which were really scaled. When Martin was talking about that he really wants to see a residential museum that. So it was meant to be that, where it was literally boxes, sort of fragmented, broken up, which sort of brought in this haptic experience of the human consciousness, and you moved through it. The design later changed because it sort of generations shifted, and Siddharth is a museum designer, he is an exhibition designer, so there are certain basic fundamentals of functionality that he would not let go of and would not accept not having. So the whole experience then changed, and then it was so from the whole idea of creating sort of a little home in Bhubaneswar for arts, it became how to sort of create a sort of a institution in the city. So the brief sort of changed, and then hence the experience and the scales and the way the building then sort of worked with the city also changed. So it's really interesting is not just how the architect plays a role in terms, but it's also the client, and it's also the vision of the client, how they wish the city to be with respect to their institution that they're building, and how they want the institution to be with respect to the city. So in Jatin's case, he really wanted the city as his extended family that would just come in. In case of Siddharth, it's really much more formal, it's a more institutionalized structure that he's trying to create. And it's also personalities. So it's very interesting to see the interview that you gave of Mrs. Nader, and how she's sort of let David have. But you see in the whole structure of Kiranada that her personality emanates through the whole system in terms of how she allows people to sort of. So I don't know whether I've answered your question, but I just think it's a very complex relationship when it comes to museum, unless it's a government museum. Even there's patronage. Like the National Gallery Nehru was hands-on into the whole image of and even now we know very clearly in Central Vista, the Prime Minister is hands-on into the design of what's happening. So it's sort of a lot of factors that play. So the experience that finally comes into the museum is actually also the personal histories of a lot of people who are involved in that.
So on the one hand, we have keeping the narrator or the curator of that museum in mind, or the patron of the museum in mind. But how do we balance the ever-growing and ever-changing dynamics of a spectator, his behavioral pattern and his way of interacting with a story or an art or an object is changing very, very dynamically. When you're designing museum, that's how much of a role spectator plays in, and the relationship with the spectator and the art needs to have. Because on what Rohit's talked about is what I, as a museum owner or a director or a curator, would like to narrate. But there is a huge element to it, which is the spectator, and how do you alienate that? And how do you make that happen for him? And a spectator's psychographics and psychology is very varied.
I mean, I think what I found interesting with what Rohit was saying was this was about, he described two museums, the Jatin Das one and Charles Correa's Bhopal museum, where you were emphasizing this idea of the self, going into the self, the disappearing. So how does architecture enable, and of course this is the view of the stakeholders to come together. And the complete counter to that is how David Ajay speaks about the KNMA, which is he's talking about clusters and villages, or you can look at them as mohallas, where actually you are actually bringing people together. So very fundamentally, in terms of scale, very different. One is about the individual and quietness and the self. The other is about kind of a building that is trying to enable a large number of people to get together. Right. So I think that architecture becomes a very critical enabler of both spectrums of these. Both, of course, are museums. Both are looking at completely different things, and I wonder how that happens. But I keep wanting to go back to sort of saying that the more I look at museums, I look at them not just as holders of knowledge and object, but really as enablers of debate and discourse, because that too it becomes, even though it's not necessarily a physical object, it is very much like what we're doing right now. We're here in a museum, and though the architecture of it is not sort of necessarily enabling this for talks to happen, because we're sitting in a gallery, increasingly museums are actually either sort of creating spaces for formal discussions or actually creating spaces for debate. So I start to look at museums as stages almost. They sit on a plinth and you have an audience, and that's where kind of, debates happen and so on and so forth. But I think that these scales within which museums operate are very important, and only when you span across the entire scale of these do you really start to get a vibrant kind of discourse and a vibrant society and a relationship with the city.
Yeah, I mean, today's museums have recognized the importance of inclusivity. There are buzzwords and words which are valued, which is co-creation, collaboration, public programming, and making public being part of the curatorial programming of a museum has become very, very critical, which may not be relevant for a museum which is only narrating one story, and it's about a personal story of a museum director, or a museum patron. But today, museum plays a critical role in dialogues, discourses, debates, and bring common people part of a programming, and what the normal term of beyond social, political, and economic impact. I mean, we're talking about how we bring culture in and how we bring changing cultural context into the curatorial values of programming, and how much of that informs your practice when you're designing a museum.
I mean, I think I'm just going to counter something that you were saying, that I think that, it's even old museums no longer are static spaces of singular narratives. So like the John Soane's Museum, or if you look at the Ashmolean Museum, they are constantly, they are housed within historic buildings with very limited space. But the narrative keeps changing, because, the curatorial sort of push is towards kind of saying, look, these are not just buildings which house collections that are of the past. These have to sort of start to discuss plunder, colonization, contemporary context, architectural evolution, so many things happen. I mean, the Ashmolean, for instance, one of the oldest museums in the world in terms of how we understand a modern museum to be, is constantly bringing in contemporary artists to respond, to artifacts that are thousands of years old. So this is, there's so much that architecture does, and there's also so much of it that is kind of controlled by how the visions of the world change. I mean, these are, museums become also at the forefront of kind of, questioning existing narratives.
Yeah, but isn't the experience becoming more immersive? Where Spectator is actually part of the storytelling.
I don't know. Can you give me an example of what? I'm sorry, I don't understand.
So, for example, I mean, when we were just in conversation with Mrs. Nada in Venice, she talked about how Ajay is designing, literally, it's a mini village where there'll be clusters of audience interacting with the artifacts, or getting immersed in the artifacts, or immersed in the storytelling of a show, which could be as basic as a show as beautiful as Pop South Asia. The immersive experience it's becoming very, very prevalent globally into the museum design. Have you started seeing that in the Indian museum context?
I'm really not sure.
Huh?
I'm not probably in best position to do.
Like, you talked about Charbagh of Korea. Isn't that an immersive installation? Long back you thought about it.
The idea, I think it was with Korea, I mean, the way I see his design and the way I see his progress as architect, it was really about the public and this idea of the public space coming in from the city going in, and the whole idea of, these notions of Medan, the notion of the courtyard, the notion of the collective coming, congregating, and also again, the disappearance of the building so that the human experience or the human collection and the gathering gains prominence. I think that was what the architects of that generation, especially those in Korea, really made a lot of effort in very different sort of typologies. They tried to do that. But I mean, I would, in the sense, I would just want to talk, when you talk about immersive experience or the whole idea of the institution of museum opening up, I just want to talk about my experience with respect to the show I did here with Rubina and my wife Andani. It was, I just brought the idea to Rubina, saying I want to do a retrospective on my father and his work, and she was like, sure, come. I mean, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have even thought a museum would be so open to just say, come, yeah, sure, let's discuss this. So for me, that was a sort of immersion where you meet someone you barely know, and you just say that I want to do this. And I met her the next day, and then we decided on a date, and then we started planning. And then while NGMA, in the meantime, had 3 shows of architects and retrospectives of theirs, where the question of the engineering of any of those architects' buildings was not even spoken about, and my father had done most of those buildings. It was out here, it was the first sign was the recognition that his contribution is immense and it needs to be celebrated. So, but for me, that was the type of immersion for me that is where the museum is changing is, the reason we all are sitting here is because of this type of immersion where it's sort of, it's an idea of opening up the dialogue, opening up the sort of, the brackets of knowledge, so to say, what defines art, what defines architecture, what defines engineering, what defines a conversation, and who takes those conversations forward. I mean, I think what this institution is doing is it's really breaking those boundaries in a very sort of clever and sophisticated way. And subsequently, I mean, thanks to that retrospective that happened here, his work, my father's work, it went to MoMA, where again, even though, again in the MoMA curatorial space, and I mean, all respect for Martino and Sean Anderson for doing what they did, but it was still, it seemed opaque in terms of the curatorial product that emerged there, but there was already a consciousness where they had to start also bringing in the engineering space into what they were showing. At least they did that for my father. So Mahendra Raj was literally put in every building he designed. He was the only engineer. Probably they should have put all the engineers, but whether it was convenience, whether they'd already seen the show, whatever it was happened there. And then you have Maxi Rome subsequently, just within the same year. This was 2022 summer. And then you have 2022 October. Maxi Rome has this show called The Architecture of Engineers, which is celebrating the engineering profession. And again, the immense contribution engineers have made. And it's reading that, again, the Hall of Nations went there. Some of the products, some of the sort of sculptures, the rebar sculptures we did here, designed here for the show, went there. And what was interesting was it was just not the two curators who sort of defined the show, but they had a whole team, Guy Nordresen and a lot of eminent engineers and architects and everyone. So it's again, that is sort of, for me, a new immersive environment that's coming out, which sort of breaks the transparency a little more than what MoMA did, because there you at least understood how the selection happened, and then they had a whole reasoning of why, what was chosen, and you could see it in the curatorial note also, which was sort of very transparent. So for me, that is the sort of immersive environment that is emerging from my experience in terms of, I can't talk about anything about curation and museums. I mean, my experience is limited to what I've done with respect to my dad's work. But this is what I'm experiencing, which I don't think I would have got this sort of response 10 years, even 10 years ago. So.
Tell me, on slightly diverting from the subject, architecture itself as a museum. I mean, we talked about Bilbao. As itself, the way the architecture is shaped, not what you go and see. It's people today from all over the world go to see Bilbao for what Bilbao is, rather beyond what they're going to see inside the building, or the show or the exhibits which are inside the building. Where are we in India, where architecture itself has a marking of a museum?
Well, I mean, for all the architects who hate Bilbao, as Gary's Bilbao building, and there are a number of them that I've come across, I still think that,
Or Pompidou Center in Paris.
or Centre Pompidou, yeah. I mean, these are actually very heroic examples of where, architecture goes well beyond just the building. It kind of manages to revitalize an entire city and a post-industrial town. In the instance of Bilbao, in Centre Pompidou, it just completely changes how architecture is. You suddenly have a completely, and I'm sure that there was a lot of protest to this massive building coming up in the middle of the historic part of Paris. But you saw the entire archigram architectural kind of propositions that were very playful and very sort of wacky and out there suddenly take shape with the students of Peter Cook and David Green and the lot of them actually then bringing this architecture out, which then goes on to impact the Lloyd's building and the Waterloo terminal, etc. So it's a huge change to architecture in that sense. And then that, of course, leads to, of course, how Zaha and the Jewish Museum, and there's large number of examples of where suddenly this need for the star architect and the star architect building starts to come in. And I think that over time what has happened is that, the edges of that have been sort of muted in some way or the other, because people are starting to think more about, going beyond that, sort of, what is the building actually doing and how is it performing and what is it sort of, what its role is beyond just being purely sculptural. And I think that we're at that stage. And as I said at the beginning, we find ourselves in this huge churn, and the museum's at the center of it. And it's too early to tell how this thing is going to pan out. But I think the KNMA is very much a part of that trajectory of architecture, expressive architecture that's happening. But it isn't in the same way as Libeskind and Zaha and Gehry, I think. But it comes from that, and I think that they, in some sense, create the foundational principles of that form of architecture. And I think that there is a little bit more critical thinking and nuance in the emergence of David Ajay's buildings in terms of how he's looking at museums, and what his other projects as well. It's too early for me to be able to say so much about this, but it is a very, very important part, and I think that it starts becoming, I think architecture in that sense plays a very important role in defining, I think, identities for communities and countries and cities, and I think it's very important.
As the practitioners, both of you, would you be able to identify a single marker in our country with such a huge, rich architectural history we have, that, wow, that's one architectural building itself can be marked as a museum?
No, I don't.
I mean, for example, we talk about Pompidou or a Louvre sitting in the center of what Empire did in the center of Louvre. He created a glass pyramid. Or we have Bilbao, you hate it or not hate it, Frank Gehry, folded paper structure. Why haven't we been able to create in today's contemporary world a museum which itself, the building itself, become an iconic talking point?
I think we're just at a different sort of, history and trajectory of development. Like, there will be those that will emerge and they will come in. And I think our relationship as a society to architecture is fundamentally different. I've always said this, that, where is the architectural criticism in our broadsheets? Who's talking about architecture? How many people are really critically thinking about it? Who's choosing the architects? There's all of these aspects to it, and I think that over time you will have buildings and discussions, and this is going to move on. But I think that we should not only think about the iconic architecture as the only representation of that. There's also a conversation about where are the public spaces as well, and they tie in, and these could be with buildings or without buildings. They could be also the absence of buildings. That create relationships. So I think that this is a discussion that is very, very much in its nascent stages here, and then needs, as it'll evolve, I think that there's going to be an emergence. I get the sense that this is very much the beginning of that cycle that you're seeing with KNMA, with, for whatever it's worth, the performance center in Bombay that has come up, and the Munjal building by Crab Studio. So you can sort of start seeing the bubbles emerge on the surface, But I think that there'll be bad ones and there'll be good ones, and there'll be debates, and it'll happen.
We haven't been able to build so long.
No, look, we had Chandigarh. Let's not forget, we had Chandigarh. We had, we have IIMs. We have buildings that have, stood for a lot globally. And and of course, then there are fantastic buildings by Indian architects here. But obviously, because of Corbusier and Kahn, they are the examples of IIMs and the mill owners building, association building, and Chandigarh become much more cited examples of it. But it's not that architecture has not sort of, perhaps as museums go, maybe not. But, though there is Corbusier's museum in Chandigarh. But I think that architecture significantly has been very, very important in framing of post-independence identity for India. And I think the show, the MoMA show, of which, everyone was a part of, was an example of actually how much architecture has shaped the understanding of our nation. Maybe not museums, and that's going to happen now. That's the sort of second chapter of it.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense also this whole idea of the star, I think India, I don't know whether India's missed the boat for the star architect, or it's getting the better half of the star architect phenomena, but it's sort of, I think there is this whole now impetus to go back, sort of with smaller ambitions, more depth, sort of localization, the whole idea of sustainability.
Yeah, and the sustainability, that's what I was going to say. That whole discourse, I mean, from when Guggenheim Bilbao starts, when you're kind of, using titanium, to where we are right now, where conversations are relevant. You cannot sort of, necessarily just go on and sort of do this, throw money at things with no consequence for what it means to the environment, to community. And I think that critics are asking much harder questions of architects as well, in terms of what does it mean in terms of regional significance, material significance, spatial significance, you just kind of don't come in. I mean, what David Ajay speaks about this, he talks about the triangle and where he sees the roots of the triangle in the subcontinental architecture, trajectories of whether, inclusive architectural history, not just singular strains, but he sees that. So feel compelled to kind of, come and talk about it. But you also see that in a lot of his African project in Ghana and Tanzania, South Africa, he's talking about it materially. So I think that the discourse has fundamentally shifted in terms of, I think sustainability and all that. How much of it is really done or not, but at least people are thinking about it. I don't think that anyone is, buildings are as sustainable as they always claim to be. But I think that, so I think these things also kind of pare things down. So probably we're lucky we kind of, missed the boat on the star architect.
And when I see Beijing and when I was in Beijing and post-Olympics and all that, it was a city of a phenomenon of star architects, interventions everywhere. And at some level it stops making sense. It's just because you can clearly say they and it was pretty rich architecturally, Beijing. But what was rich about it were the local architects who were doing smaller things and sort of more intimate things rather than a Stephen Hall or a Rem Koolhaas or something like that, which were just icons in space, which were self-referential objects. And I think in a way, India has a lot to be proud of. For some reason, we are not proud of our history. But when you think about Doshi, Kuria, Rajwal, the Delhi generation, Martand's dad, and they all worked with scale. They all worked with the materiality. They all worked with, like Doshi, Kuria, the whole idea of the building becoming a non-object. It's exactly the opposite of what Gehry or Zaha Hadid or any of these star architects try and do. They try and make a self-referential space or an object which it defines them wherever they may be throughout the world. While these architects actually try to, in a way, hide themselves into let the object speak for itself and let the human experience speak for themselves. And we really don't give ourselves that much credit for the type of identity that was coming, which got totally destroyed with the liberalization of India in the 90s. And then aluminium sheets came in and metal came in, and we lost our way, we lost our thinking, and we lost the critical, whatever little critical theoretical ground that architecture had developed where it was like a flood that just washed it away. And we have to bring it back. We have to bring it back, and we have to be actually very wary of the idea of star architects, and start celebrating localism and regionalism much, much more if we want to sort of mark our footprints.
Last question to both of you. If you're given a free hand to create a museum, what would be your dream museum be like? Cultural, no cultural context, society, no societal context, star, no star architects. What would your dream museum be like? You, an artist yourself, what would that mean to you too?
I think Martand goes first. He's designing.
I mean, I don't know. It's too broad a question. It's almost like the subject of our advertised conversation that we will discuss architectural history. So I mean, I think we've touched upon some of these ideas, and I think that the museum that would sound like an ideal museum sitting here right now to be thought of as the museum of the future from today would.
One in Dubai, yeah.
No, I don't mean that one. I meant just a museum that will be in the future, not of the future. A museum in the future, I suppose, would sort of be this sort of space which kind of brings the city in, and as the museum goes out to the city, I think that would be the ideal kind of space, which is probably collection neutral. Allows for it to sort of evolve over time and respond to anything from the contemporary to the history, but really I think one that enables a lot of discourse, one that is materially relevant, climatically relevant. I don't have so much of a problem with more monumental buildings as maybe Rohit does. So I don't mind that if it were to be a big building that is kind of, because I think that sometimes societies need, they need those markers, and I think Corbusier's sort of Chandigarh is a great example of that, where he talks about, the capital complex as that's the big marker, that's the star architect, and then the city that kind of, is quieter, because, you have these monuments to political ideals. Right, and I think that's what a place like Chandigarh does, or for instance, what Dhaka Assembly does for Bangladesh. Like it's a marker of kind of national identity in certain ways. So I think that the heroic building is not, to me, is important. It's as important as the quiet building is. But so I think it could be a museum like that, or. In another way, it could just be maybe 100 small, really quiet museums scattered through a city. So you really blur the boundaries between what the museum is and where the city is, and how you kind of experience various aspects of it. But
it's all intertwined.
Well, intertwined, but it always kind of challenges. It always challenges a viewer. It always instigates a conversation. So almost in a sense, the building may be secondary. But are you able to kind of, start those conversations? Are you able to start new ways of thinking? Are you able to start discussions and debates? That is a great museum. And that may just be a plinth in the middle of a busy street. Or it may be a massive museum, somewhere with hundreds of things that kind of,
It's really abstract. It's again. It's not that I don't. I like monumental architecture and all that, but it's just the whole idea of the star architecture in our generation. It's just gone a bit wacky, in a sense. In the sense, this whole sort of branding of architecture, almost, so to say. So I mean, like Louis Kahn, Corbusier. They were still so much more rooted to the space and society than some of the architects now are. But in terms of for me, it would more become the questioning the institution of museums itself, because it is a colonial hangover. It is something that came with colonies, you know, I mean, it is something that came with enlightenment, which is also a Western product. So we are actually perpetuating the whole idea of sort of bringing objects from another space and putting it for display, or sort of questioning the idea of the religious institutions and creating another space of knowledge. So it's all. So for me, it would be interesting to understand, like, what would the institution be as a concept, as a program, which challenges these notions, and then yeah, architecturally, I think either ways, like what Martin said, both will work. Something that disappears into the street, or something that becomes an icon for the city. But as long as we know why we're doing it, and why the society we are in, and I'm not talking about today, since you asked an abstract question, in the abstraction of that society, why we are doing it. We should know that.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think on one hand, museums or institutions, cultural institutions have a huge role to play in terms of archiving and narrating the history. On the other hand, we also know that the expression of art forms is changing very rapidly. There's intervention of technology, there's new media art, there's immersive experience being created all over the world. Tomorrow's Spectator would come with a very different mindset into a cultural institution or museum, where the whole definition of museum might change for tomorrow. And I think we're on the helm of the time where India has huge opportunity to tread both the paths. Museum for future, museum depicting past for future. Thank you. If you have any questions here, and if you want to interact with, thank you.
That was an interesting conversation. The topic I thought we were about to speak about was the change in the architecture in Delhi. You know, that's what essentially drew me here. And I got a sense that, I get a sense that we are destined to just be at the mercies of individuals who come and, Rohit, you mentioned briefly about star architects and all that, you know. So typically what we are seeing in terms of building in India is people, or you know, you'll have some individual who'll come and build a building, and it'll become either it becomes talked about or it's not spoken about, it becomes something. When will we really get to see a more holistic approach to architecture in our country, and what will bring that about? Because I think what's happening a lot is you'll have arbitrary construction. City planning is not involved in building so much. Urban planning is not involved. It's almost at the mercy of some, you know, it's like a person sitting in a PWD office decides this needs to be done. There is no holistic thinking. What would take for us to think through this more holistically is?
I think what happens in Indian urbanism is that it's a top-down approach done by certain departments. So I don't think Rohit or I or several of us architects within the community are at all part of any large consultative process, right?
What will it take for that to happen?
A miracle, I think, is the answer that you're looking for. But basically, it is just that if you need broader participation, you need discourse, but not just of architects, I think. I think it's really important to give power to communities. So by communities, I mean colonies, the mohallas, the stakeholders. I mean, what happens in several sort of, you know, cities around the world is propositions are made, architects come, they discuss it with the stakeholders. It could be a bench. Or it could be a building, right? So I think that if the city is not involved, and if the citizens are not empowered, and the architects are not part of the discourse, then someone dictates the city to you, and so we fall into you know, little sort of, you know, slots which are plots, and we as architects design for our clients. I mean. I'm also a practicing sculptor, and I think that the reason that I started sculpting was because my sculptural practice really talks about the city. And for 15 years of my practice here, when you study architecture in college, you talk about, the people, the markets, the public buildings. And you come here and you're like farmhouse, shop interior, 4 flats on, 800 square yards. And so I think what happened is that after 15 years, I really felt that, my area of where I had any say, if you consider the client, not much say actually, in the end, was only limited to the plot. And so the art practice for me was allowing me to really talk about the city. I mean, the rights, the workers, the builders, the people on the street. So it was this sort of, desire to kind of engage at a broader scale with the city. And I think that it's not just the architects, it's all of us. I mean, if we're disempowered or we don't have those abilities, you should read the Delhi bylaws if ever you do. And it's just kind of, walking through a maze. So the answer is that what it takes is it will take a miracle. And,
Yeah, so whether we like
but
it or...
also I want to say that this is not only true of architecture, this is also true of anything from education to mohalla clinics to, how funds are utilized, whether you're looking at, drains or whether you're looking at lights. So all of that stuff, who has the say? So.
Fortunately, a lot of it seems to be a political decision, which I think, of course, communities need to get more involved. I think as citizens also there is lack of involvement. But I think it seems just unfortunately that it needs to be a more political decision than anything else. The Central Vista being the perfect example. So yeah, Rohit.
I agree. I mean, in the sense it'll take a miracle to undo what started. I mean, you have to take in the colonial history in mind also, and where we were after independence. But even if we abstract it, like Amit likes us to, create abstractions and talk about it, and if we just talk about today and forget about our history, I think we have to start changing ourselves. In this, if these community dialogues. I took a few studios in SPA, urban design, and there were these community participation sort of processes that some of the studios took. And the feedback would mostly be in the neighborhood. It used to come down to parking. So in the sense, and it's not parking for the fact that how can I let go of a car, it's about how can I add one more car. So I think we as a society, if we want to create a city which talks about public space, talks about pedestrianization, again, everything that is Eurocentric, but even if we think that way, we have to start giving up certain luxuries, certain taken for granted situations that we ourselves. And so I think we're a long way from there.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, you have the cycling paths that have been made. They end into nowhere. There's one thing, plonk in the middle of some street. So if you try and bike...
But they end in nowhere, and we can blame the government, but it's also...
No, I'm not blaming. I'm just saying, why is that thinking of holistic thinking not yeah.
But the point is also that the public that uses it, the cars don't respect that cycle lane.
Sure.
And the cyclists, the pedestrians don't respect the cycle lane. So sidewalks are meant for walking, then you have motorbikes coming on that. So we don't respect the spaces which are, and maybe one can say the idea of Indianness is that, I mean, this was something which I used to hate, which a lot of these architects, since I've appreciated them so much that we sort of give them a little cut-all. So all the architects of the generation which I spoke about, they used to speak about this rasa theory, that everything, in India, it's about the thali, everything is mixed and then you eat it. And so you can say that Indian society is that we don't know how to differentiate and the flavors come by mixing everything. So biker goes on the sidewalk and the pedestrian goes on the cycle path and the cyclist is on the road and I don't know where the car is. But the point is that we as a society really need to really think deeply about ourselves and where we are and how we have to take responsibility. And otherwise we will get something like the Central Vista, which is top down, which of another level altogether. So.
We're sitting in Saket, and I think it's important to think back to about a decade ago when we did have the BRT here, which actually prioritized the poorer citizens of our city and how hard the newspapers came down upon it and how that scheme was crushed because it prioritized buses and cyclists and street hawkers over individual cars. And it was also top-down planning, interestingly. I mean, we were looking at Colombia, and we were looking at great examples in Latin America when we were thinking about our city. And it was crushed, and it was crushed really brutally, and that was the end of that. Because, I mean, this battle of the car and the city has, Jane Jacobs, I mean, so the people have fought it off in the West as well, People did make great sort of public transport systems in economies like ours around the world. But I think that everything works in Ahmedabad.
BRT has been a huge success in Ahmedabad because it was planned in the way it was. And I don't know what went wrong with the planning here. It was unfortunate what happened here. But, or I didn't get a chance, I don't know.
Anyway. Oh, somebody at the back.
When we were discussing the point of museums and why we don't have an iconic museum in our country, and we're comparing it with Guggenheim Museum in US and the other one, I think it's a bit unfair to make that comparison for the reason that these are countries that are well off and developed compared to our country, which is developing currently. And I think if a decision is taken to make a museum iconic and for that reason spending a good amount, one has to be answerable to the public as well, which won't be that easy compared to a developed country where we're comparing the state of museums.
Sure, we take that as a comment. I'm assuming it's a comment, not a question.
I mean, I don't think anyone was lamenting it. I mean, none of us sitting here sort of said that we should necessarily have a Guggenheim here at all. I'm just saying that it's a different trajectory, different journeys, and every country has its own path. I don't think there's anything that.
If we speak outside of museums, like. There would be certain pieces of architecture which I think architects and non-architects can agree upon. Like if you talk about the Lotus Temple, it is something that is iconic as well. People visit it. People don't visit it as a temple really, which its integral function, but just to see it. So that is one example. In terms of significance, if we speak. This is not post-independence. If you speak of Connaught Place, so there, if you from any class, if you're like well off also, or if you don't have that kind of money, still all kind of people go there, and from all parts of the Delhi, since we're discussing about Delhi. So even if you have to meet, that is the central location people go. So in terms of significance, we have such spaces. But like, again, when we're talking about museums separately, I think
you should take this question to the people who are building the Central Vista. This is not the forum for this. Your question is so apt, but it's for the other parts of Delhi which are being developed, and this museum is a privately funded museum. So it is actually, it's a totally different, and that's how America also built itself with respect to museums. It was through private funding. The point is, India, when it was a really poor country, which was post-independence, we had the best architects, and one of like Louis Kahn Corbusier came here and they did what they did. And today India is not a poor country, so we should be out of that imagination that we are poor. It is a country which has a huge class difference and economic difference. That is a different social issue which we weren't discussing really here. So.
Like मुझे ऐसा like just ऐसा बात like हमको ऐसा बात कर like मैं articulate नहीं कर पा रहा हूँ like हमको बात करना जो migration हो रहा है like rural to urbans लोग जो इतनी speed से आ रहे हैं like economically problems और socially conditions में जहाँ वो रहते हैं rural area में वो urbans में आ रहे हैं वो daily हो रहा है like daily percentage बढ़ते जा रहे हैं तो उसके लिए हम लाइक क्या कर रहे हैं लाइक इन प्रेजेंट डेज जैसे लाइक हम ऐसा इंडिपेंडेंस के बाद की बात करेंगे जो हमने सिटीज़ डेवलप की तो उसमें भी हमने एक आइडिया पहले एक पूरा आइडिया डेवलप करके पहले कोई एक आर्किटेक्ट को हायर किया बट उनको छोड़ के फिर कॉर्ब्यूजर का आइडिया ज़्यादा पसंद आया बट लोग उसको उनको भी क्रिटिसाइज़ किए कि इसमें इंडियननेस कुछ नहीं है तो लाइक हम अभी कौन से स्टेज पे है एज ए इंडिया जो माइग्रेशन हो रहा है लाइक अभी हम प्रोवाइड कर पा रहे हैं उनको हम उनके बेसिक नीड्स
देखिए बात तो हम यहाँ म्यूज़ियम्स की कर रहे हैं तो ये सवाल कुछ चला गया उस दूसरी दिशा में लेकिन हाँ हो रहा है माइग्रेशन हो रहा है अर्बनाइजेशन हो रहा है और डिस्क्रिपेंसी बहुत है प्लान नहीं किया गया क्यों लोग आते हैं यहाँ पर क्योंकि बेरोज़गारी है मेडिकल फैसिलिटीज़ नहीं है यू नो हाँ देखिए माइग्रेशन की वजह अलग अलग होती हैं तो वो तो हो रहा है और क्या हमारे शहर तैयार हैं इन लोगों को यहाँ रिसीव करने के लिए बिल्कुल नहीं लेकिन जो थाली के बारे में बात की ना हम सब एडजस्ट कर लेते हैं ना फिर भी क्योंकि करना पड़ता है क्योंकि वो भी हमारे इसी देश के मतलब सिटीजन्स ही है ना तो आई डोंट नो it needs planning, it needs thinking, it needs you know thinking 30 years ahead, 40 years ahead. वो नहीं हो रहा है लेकिन जब तक इसके जो रूट कॉजेज इसके साथ हम डील नहीं करेंगे तो ये तो होता रहेगा.
So I think I have a slightly more specific question. I went to actually the Rashtrapati Bhavan Museum today. I don't know whoever that gentleman was. It seems like a child has just put things together without any logic. My question was that I am a huge museum buff. Just today I went to the Rashtrapati Bhavan Museum as well as the Philately Museum, which was closed. Oddly enough, on weekends it closes. It's going to open on Monday. But I think there's we're talking of museums as if it's it's H2O. It's a water is equal to H2O, which I don't think that's true. I think every museum, everybody who's whoever is going to design it or is going to create it is going to define that museum for themselves. And I think, at least in Delhi, that definition is not clear. I think Crafts Museum is possibly the only one that I saw when Dr. Jitendra Jain, he created it. There was a vibrancy to it. There was a dynamism to it because he knew what he was doing. He had an idea. There was an organic link between, what his thinking was, the museum, and what was created. So my question was that which are one of your favorite museums in India? I mean, where do you see some kind of an organic logic?
I don't have any favorite museum in India. I mean, I agree with you that Craft Museum is the closest to what I really appreciate in terms of the synergy, that you could sense the synergy. And that's why I brought up this, when the question was asked about JDCA. That's why it's like the museum as a structure comes from this synergy. That's exactly what it is. So in JDCA, when the roles shift and when the visionary shifts, the design shifts, everything shifts, So, quite frankly, in terms of architecture, I love the Craft Museum. In terms of programming and what the museum is offering to the city, I love this space. And in terms of internationally, if I think of any museum which I really, really sort of got this sense of synergy. I mean, immediately what comes back to is the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice for me. That's when I fell in love with the whole idea of curated culture, because of just it's not the object, it's not about the object, but it's about the space, it's about the history, it's where it emerged. And it was still located in that space. And that sort of brought the whole cycle together for me. So for me, that really makes sense as a museum. So that's my answer.
I think we're going to take last question from Ricardo.
Hi, good evening. I'm an architect from London and a long-time friend of Mr. Amit Gupta. Very fascinating talk this evening, and obviously we've expanded from museums to the public realm and the space that they sit in. But I think perhaps more important, certainly viewed from a distance, to me it seems like this current wave of museums that are being built or are planned in India seems as much a political move as well as a cultural one. What do you think, esteemed architect? What's your feeling about that, and are you comfortable with it?
I mean, yes, absolutely. I think that museums by governments in all over the world will be political, and we're not sort of different in that sense. But as the lady sitting here said, that the Craft Museum is an example of something that was very vibrant when someone was heading it, whereas the Philately Museum, is probably a very static space. So I think that museums, at one level, create shells. What happens within them will change, and that changes with whoever is politically in power. So I think that this churn constantly happens. The previous powers had their museums, these ones have theirs, and then eventually these museums will have different curators and history will be told differently. But we are going, and that carries on. I think you can see that with history in terms of how buildings have remained, but those who've had access to it, the stories that they have told, how those corrections are happening within narratives, are continuously shifting. I think you'll see that in England right now. I think that when we look at narratives around, Cecil Rhodes or slave trade or racism or colonial plunder, the museums remain, the stories change. So I think that, we're going through a phase where we'll probably have 73 museums, Amit told us, and, they will tell a story, and believe you me that, in 20 years that story will be different, and, 20 years later it'll be different again. And I think that's part of the evolution of a society, and the way societies are not static, their representative buildings are not static. So I think that, we live with that. We're still, I do believe that we're still deeply and truly democratic, and even in democracy there are many, many narratives. That's sort of my personal.
Yeah, there's definitely a political angle, so I think less said the better. We live in that age now. I'm happy that India's, whether it's political or not, there's a whole space for culture that's emerging. But we, in the past, have also seen a lot of museums being built, and with state patronage, like the National Gallery, and which then went into defunct ruins because it just became a bureaucratic space. So let's see where this goes. It may start from a political space, it may start from state patronage, whichever way you want to call it. Right now we're saying it political, but what Nehru did was also political, just to be fair in a public space. But after that, like what Martin said, what happens with it? That synergy that is so essential, the synergy. This museum is in a mall, but it's a live space. That synergy needs to be there between the vision, the patron, the people who run it, the people who conceptualize it, the audience, everyone. So hopefully we'll have a great cultural space in the next 50 years. I don't know.
Thank you. And we all just hope that it somehow balances out. On one hand, we'll have the political parties in power who will have their agenda to skew the narratives or to narrate the narrative that they want to. At the same time, we'll have private initiatives like KNMA and many other which are coming up, of MAP in Bangalore and Bridge in Delhi. And we hope that we will strike a balance somewhere where the audience will also be intelligent enough to weigh the viewpoints of where the creative, cultural community, the creative economy as well as the cultural commentary is headed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martand, Amit, Rohit. Thank you very much.